Welcome back, Daisy Cakes. This is part 6 of my list of top 100 fantasy authors. Who am I? I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I've compiled a top 100 list of my favorite fantasy writers, arranged them in alphabetical order, and broken them up into groups of 10. I'm also doing a list of top 100 science fiction authors, so be sure to check that out too. Today we are starting with a children's author, Tae Keller, who was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and graduated from Bryn Mawr College in 2015. Her debut novel was The Science of Breakable Things, published in 2018, but her next novel is what really made her famous and the one I recommend. When You Trap a Tiger was published in 2020 and went on to win the Newbery Medal, which is the most prestigious children's award. It lives in that really nebulous subgenre of fantasy called magical realism, where magic can maybe be seen just out of the corner of your eye. Maybe it exists. It probably exists, but maybe it doesn't. The story is about a girl named Lily who mysteriously sees a tiger that no one else can see. When Lily and her mother and sister move in to live with her Korean grandmother, we learn about the role of tigers in Korean folktales. And could her grandmother's failing health be connected with something her grandmother did to the tigers? I wanted to include this children's book on this list because it actually did make me cry. I think it's a really moving and special book. So we're going to make a 180-degree turn away from children's books because the next author is Stephen King. King is the megastar author I'm sure you must know if you read any books at all. He was born in 1947 and his debut novel, Carrie, was published in 1974 and became a bestseller, establishing King as the king of horror. So, why am I including King in a list of fantasy authors? Honestly, I think many of his works could be science fiction, especially those that deal with one of sci-fi's perennial favorites, psychic powers like Firestarter and Dead Zone, and yes, maybe even Carrie. That's the thing about speculative fiction. There can be a lot of overlapping or blending of genres and subgenres among science fiction, fantasy, and horror. That's to say that my favorite King books are what I consider contemporary dark fantasy, namely the Dark Tower series, which started with The Gunslinger, published in 1982, and ends with The Dark Tower, published in 2004. There are 7 novels in the main series, and there's also an 8th book published in 2012 that comes in the middle of the series called The Wind Through the Keyhole, which I don't think you really need to read, but why not? Anyway, the story is about a gunslinger, basically an old-fashioned Clint Eastwood spaghetti western type cowboy named Roland of Gilead, who is chasing his nemesis, the Man in Black, through this weird, twisted dimension or reality that is, well, it feels post-apocalyptic. It's definitely seen better days. And Roland meets up with a human boy named Jake from our world, from New York City, who has somehow stumbled into this nightmare realm. King was inspired by the Robert Browning poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which he read as a sophomore in college. I think this is King's magnum opus. I used to think it was a stand, but after reading the entire Dark Tower series, I believe this is his greatest work, at least to date. After all, he is still writing. Oh, I am so excited for this next author because she is my new favorite fantasy author. T. Kingfisher is a pseudonym of Ursula Vernon, born in 1977, who first published under her own name as a children's author, notably the series Dragon Breath and Hamster Princess. When she began publishing adult works, she adopted the name T. Kingfisher to differentiate her children's and adult fiction. And she came out swinging in adult fantasy, winning both the Hugo and Nebula. I love her work. Even her children's fiction as Ursula Vernon is worth checking out. Look up Castle Hangnail, a really funny and adorable story about a little girl who decides to become a wicked witch. But as T. Kingfisher, I like all her books so much. It's hard to choose just one to recommend, but I think I'm going to go with Nettle and Bone, which won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locust. It's a dark fairy tale that takes the fairy godmother figure and raises her to new heights. It's about a princess named Mara, who is the youngest of three sisters. When her older sister is shipped off to marry an abusive king, Mara decides to take action. What's really amazing is the writing. Kingfisher retains that whimsical, rich, humorous voice that she developed as a children's author and uses it to tell really dark and disturbing tales. I love it. T.J. Klune is another author who has a whimsical writing voice. Klune was born in 1982, and his first novel, Bear, Otter, and the Kid, was published in 2011 about a gay couple raising a child. Klune identifies as asexual and writes mostly in the LGBTQIA space, but his novels have broken into the mainstream, starting with my recommendation, House in the Cerulean Sea, published in 2020. This is a story about Linus Baker, a sort of dumpy man who works for the department in charge of magical youth. So, yes, this is a contemporary fantasy where magic is known, though maybe not respected, certainly not for the children who live in an orphanage, which is the House in the Cerulean Sea. Linus is assigned to investigate, and the people he finds and the relationships he forms changes his life. It's a wonderful, whimsical story. I think we can call it a cozy, and it went on to become a bestseller. This is another one of those I bet you never heard of authors, and that is Elise Kova. Now, I know I've said I'm not a big fan of romantasy, the romance fantasy mashup, but there's always exceptions, and that's why I am including Elise Kova with her Air Awakens young adult fantasy series that starts with Air Awakens, published in 2015. Well before romantasy was even a term used for the fantasy romance subgenre, I bought it just as a fantasy book, but if you are a romantasy fan, run, don't walk to the Air Awakens books. It's about a young woman who is the ultimate bookworm. She is the apprentice to a librarian, and the Solaris Empire may be conquering the world around her, but at least she has her own little quiet life among books. That is until she unknowingly saves the life of the crown prince, who also happens to be a powerful sorcerer. And it is discovered that she possesses rare elemental magic. This is a very readable, somewhat typical, but super fun series. One of the recent big hitters in the world of fantasy is R.F. Kuang. Born in China in 1996, Kuang is one of the most educated authors you'll ever find, with degrees from Cambridge, Oxford, and Yale. Her debut novel, The Poppy Wars, published in 2018, is the first in a trilogy of an amazing anti-hero story set in a fantasy world based on the Second Sino-Japanese War. But the book I recommend, which blew me away, is Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators' Revolution, published in 2022. It went on to win many awards, including the Nebula. I think it would have won the Hugo if there wasn't some shenanigans in the Hugo Awards that year. Anyway, it is an alternate history of the 1830s where magic is a real and exploited system based on silver bars and languages. It is a really interesting magic system. The story is about a half-Chinese, half-English boy named Robin who finds himself caught between two worlds during the Opium Wars between Britain and China. This was my top book of the year for 2022 and one that I think should become a classic. Oh, now we have to talk about Mercedes Lackey, who is one of the most prolific fantasy authors ever. Born in 1950, Lackey writes 5.5 books a year and has published over 140 novels. In 2021, she was named the Damon Knight Grandmaster, the Lifetime Achievement Honor from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. I have read a ton of Mercedes Lackey books, mostly based in the world of Valdemar, where chosen people bond with magic horses called companions and gain special powers. My favorite books are the last Herald Mage books, whose main character, Vaniel, is a gay mage. This was published in 1989, well before there was really any such thing as gay mainstream fantasy. But if you're just getting into the world of Valdemar, I think you should start with Arrows of the Queen, published in 1987, the first Valdemar book, and first in a trilogy known as the Arrows Trilogy. It introduces the world of Valdemar through the main character Talia, who is unexpectedly chosen by a companion horse named Roland. Then she and Roland make their way to become the Queen's own herald. These are fast fantasy reads where you'll find out why Mercedes Lackey is what I think of as the queen of plotting and pacing. Fonda Lee was born in Canada in 1979 and has written one of my favorite trilogies ever, the Green Bones Saga, which starts with Jade City, published in 2017. The world building is unique because the technology level is around the 1970s, which is pretty unusual for fantasy. But what I think is really impressive is that these novels are metaphors for the Cold War, not from the viewpoint of one of the major powers, but one of the smaller nations caught in the constant escalation of conflict between the two major powers. However, in this world, the nation of Kuang, there's something that makes them unique, which no one else in the world has: the magic power of Jade. Jade grants superhuman powers, but only to those of a certain bloodline. The story is about one of the family clans, the No Peak clan, who is in perpetual conflict with the Mountain clan and have divided Kuang into two zones. The clans are sort of mafia-type organizations, only they are not crime lords since nothing they do is illegal, but it does raise the question of the legitimacy of might makes right, even if they strive to be honorable. This is also one of those rare generational stories that you don't usually find in fantasies, at least not in the same storyline. I can't say enough good things about the Green Bones Saga, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't. It's also one of those books that makes me wonder, why hasn't there been a series or a movie based on it yet, because it is so perfect for an adaptation. Let's go old school with the Hugo Award-winning author. I'm talking about Fritz Leiber, born in 1910. And I'm not including him just because I'm friends with someone who was his assistant. Hey, Lee. Leiber is a Golden Age author, writing mainly in the pulp magazines in the 30s and 40s, writing a lot of Lovecraft-inspired horror. His father was an actor also named Fritz Leiber, and people would later mix up the two, especially since the author Fritz Leiber did do some acting, having grown up in an acting family. Like a lot of the Golden Age writers, he mostly focused on short stories because you could make more money writing short stories in those days. If you are into fantasy, you've probably heard of his Vafford and Grey Mouser stories, which are several volumes of short stories about this pair of Conan-type rogues or adventurers. But the book I want to recommend is one of his weird ones, Conjure Wife, published in 1943. I don't think this novel could be published today, and I'm sure many people who pick it up would go, what? But it is, I guess I'd call it a contemporary fantasy horror, contemporary for the 1940s, because it is the ultimate men's paranoia story. There is this vast conspiracy that secretly women control everything and pretend to let men think they're in control because naturally women are witches. The story is about a young couple, Norman and Tansy. Norman is an up-and-coming sociology professor who finds out his wife is practicing witchcraft. He makes her stop, and then immediately his life unravels because she has been secretly protecting him and advancing his career. I think this is such a unique novel for the time it was written. And by the way, there have been several movie adaptations, the last of which was in 1980 with the movie Witch's Brew starring Terry Garr. In 2019, it also won the Retro Hugo for Best Novel of 1944. We started with a children's author, and we're going to end with a children's author, C.S. Lewis, who is probably my favorite children's author when I was growing up because he wrote the Narnia series, starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, published in 1950. Lewis was born in 1898 and died in 1963 at the age of 64. He was a contemporary of J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, both authors were in the same writing group known as the Inklings. If you don't know, the Narnia books are about children traveling to the fantasy world of Narnia, the first time through a wardrobe, making Narnia one of the templates for portal fantasies. My first introduction to Narnia was not through the books. I was in second grade when the high school kids put on a production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I was obsessed. I remember seeing the high school actress who played the White Witch after the show, and I pointed at her and screamed, "Witch!" I'm sure she's probably still telling that story today. Yes, C.S. Lewis is also a Christian philosopher, and there are a lot of Christian themes in the books. I mean, you meet Santa Claus at one point, but I never really picked up on that as a kid. There are a total of 7 Narnia books, which were written in a 6-year period. Of all the Narnia books, my favorite may be The Magician's Nephew, which chronologically is the first book in the series and tells about the creation of Narnia. My least favorite, and everyone's least favorite, is The Last Battle, which is about the end of Narnia, where everyone dies. Yes, it's a children's book about the eschaton. That's my list for today. This is part 6 of a 10-part series of the top 100 fantasy authors. Let me know what you think of these authors down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.